Labas rytas, gerbiami dalyviai konferencijos. Good morning to our guests from abroad. Porą tokių administracinių dalykų prieš pradedant konferenciją. Labai visų prašau išjungti savo mikrofonus, juos įjungti tik, kai galėsite kalbėti. O klausimų ir pasisakymų laikas numatytas 12:30, nuo 12:30 iki 1 valandos. Tai po kiekvieno pranešėjo, jeigu turėsite klausimą, galite rašyti į chat, bet jis bus atsakomas numatytų laiku. So short message for our international guests. Welcome to this conference. We are glad you're joining us. Just reminding you that you can use interpretation. Please choose the interpretation and language, which is English. And if you want to ask some questions or to tell something, the time is 12:30. Not right after each presentation, but just 12:30. Thank you all. Ačiū visiems. Ir žodis suteikiamas Edgarui Jadai.
Labas rytas, kolegos.
Good morning,
Tikrai
colleagues.
dėkui už jūsų
I
laiką,
really appreciate your
už
time
jūsų
and
dėmesį
attention to
mūsų
this project
šitam
and
projektui, šitam
event.
renginiui. Daugelis iš jūsų
Many of you
jau yra
have
dalyvavę
already
rugsėjo
attended the
22
workshop
seminare,
of the
tai
22nd of
kažkuria
September.
prasme jau tie, kurie mus
So
seka
please
iš
don't
anksčiau,
mind
tai
those of you
nematykite.
who are following us from earlier.
Šiek tiek kartosimės.
We will
Dabar
repeat
dėl mūsų
ourselves a
auditorijos,
little
tai
bit.
dar šiandien
Regarding
ryte
our
peržiūrėjau
audience,
registracijos
I
duomenis,
looked
tai
at the
tikrai
registration
organizatoriai,
data this
tie,
morning,
kurie
and
šį
apart from the
seminarą taip
organizers who are organizing
organizuoja
this event in
vieną
one
kartą
way or
metais.
another,
Iš tikrųjų,
and
taip
talking
įdomiai
a lot
sutapo, kad
about
lygiai
it,
100,
there are exactly
lygiai
100
100
participants,
dalyvių. Ir 17 iš jų yra mūsų
17
kolegos
of
iš
whom
užsienio
are
šalių.
our colleagues
Tai
from abroad.
labai, kaip sakyt, intensyviausiai dalyvauja. Tai
The
mūsų
most intensive
patys
participation
artimiausi
is
kaimynai
from our
iš
closest
Latvijos.
neighbors from Latvia.
Sveikinu Latvijos kolegas.
Congratulations to our
Mačiau
Latvian
Ivarsą, tai
colleagues. I saw Ivars
labai
in the
malonu,
list.
Ivarsai.
It is really very nice,
Linkėjimai į Rygą.
Ivars. Greetings to Riga.
Taip pat kolegos iš Lenkijos,
We
kolegos
also
iš
have
Švedijos,
colleagues from
kolegos
Poland,
iš Rumunijos.
Sweden, Romania.
Dar turėjo būti, nematau, viena
There should
kolegė,
also be
kuri
one
iš
colleague
tikrųjų
who is
labai
a
daug
big
talkina
help
ir dirba Europos komisijos
and
DG
works
ECHO
for the
direktorate. Tai
European
Miriam,
Commission
jeigu ten
DG
kažkur esi,
ECHO.
tai
Miriam, if you
irgi
are
būk, kaip
there,
sakant, sveika ir tau visokeriopos sėkmės.
welcome and
Tai
wish you good luck.
aš iš tikrųjų be tų visų pasisveikinimų dar turiu tokį
In addition to all the
pranešimą,
greetings, I
pasistengsiu
have
tikrai
a
20
presentation
minučių
to
tilpti.
make,
Bendra
and I will try to
informacija,
fit
ką
into 20
man irgi
minutes.
jau besiregistruojantis kolegos
I
uždavė
have already
klausimą.
been asked by
Tai
colleagues
ar
who
bus
are
šita
registering
medžiaga
whether this
kažkur vėliau
material will be
parodyta,
shown or
paviešinta. Tai
made
norim
public
patikinti, kad
somewhere later.
šitas
We would like to assure you
renginio
that the
video
video of
įrašas
this
bus
event
įkeltas
will definitely
į
be
mūsų
uploaded to
svetainę,
our
bus
website
išplatintas tikrai
and
visą
will be
įrašą, ką
distributed.
šiandien išgirsit,
Everything
pamatysit,
you hear and see
galėsite
today
jau
will be available for you
pasižiūrėti
to view and
ir
use as
atitinkamai
appropriate.
pagal poreikį naudoti. Atitinkamai visa medžiaga irgi
It is of
šito
particular
projekto,
interest
ypač
to our
užsienio
foreign
kolegoms,
colleagues
tas
that all the
bus aktualu
material from this
angliškai, kad būtų
project is
išversta.
in
Tai
English.
mes irgi pasistengsim šitą
We will
anglišką
therefore
lengvą
endeavor to
versiją jums
provide you with the English version in due
perduoti per tam
course.
tikrą laiką. Kolegos iš labai
Our
Jostros
colleagues at
šiuo metu
Jostra
peraiškino, kaip
are in the process
organizuoja
of
ir
organizing
investicinio
the
projekto.
translation
Ir
of the
šito
investment
renginio, kaip matot,
project.
yra
And this
sinchroniškai
event is
komunikuotas
also being
viskas.
interpreted
Sklandžiai vyksta, jeigu
simultaneously.
kas nors
I hope everything is
negirdi
going
tinkamai
smoothly.
vertimo, tai duokit
If
mums
anyone does
žinutę.
not hear the
Tai
interpreting
va, tai
properly, please
šituo
let us
požiūriu
know.
tikrai visą informaciją mes
We will
sudarysim
definitely share
ir
all the information and
bus viskas
everything
gerai.
will be fine.
Tai gerai, tada aš perinu prie mano tos
I will now turn to my
priemonės.
slides.
Tikėkimės
Let's hope everything goes
viskas vyks
smoothly.
sklandžiai. Ar matot laimę?
Can you see my screen, Laima?
Matom.
Yes, yes, we do.
Labai gerai.
Very good.
Tai seminare sakiau,
At the beginning of the seminar, there was a question, do you believe? I believe that everyone who believes in what we are doing is now here. Now we are moving on to the next step, together. This is the symbolic word I have already mentioned. I think it is very meaningful. This project also shows that it is only together that we can achieve some significant victories or results. Now, a little bit about the project itself. It started in early 2019. I had to go to Brussels to consult with my EC colleagues on the so-called preventive readiness call. It was called back then Track 1. And it was a kind of a pilot project where the European Commission decided to support the member states by providing what is so-called seed funding. That is to say, by giving some money so that countries could improve in certain areas. There was an emphasis on feasibility studies and various analyses. We were actually a little more ambitious. We have chosen an investment project as an objective. And as I understand it, that investment project and its application was suitable and appreciated by the European Commission. Well, we signed the contract. As I understand, the pandemic in 2020 has put an end to everything. In practice, the time axis is now really extended. But I'm glad that we are here, where we are now, and that we can discuss what data we have collected. As far as the main activities are concerned, the main activity was probably explaining what is the shortcoming that we are here talking about. There have certainly been many times and many angles of discussion on the assessment of the capacity gap. And this capacity gap assessment is the basis on which JOSTRA has based its investment project. Well, the ancillary activities that have been somewhat disrupted by the pandemic are the study visits. We managed to organize the first visit before the pandemic, and then the planned visit to Japan in 2020 could no longer take place because of the pandemic. We have now abandoned the Japan direction at all. In the meantime, we are still negotiating with our Swiss counterparts to be able to share experiences online. And the bigger events of the project that were foreseen, which is the seminar and the final conference, have taken place. The workshop has been a few weeks away, and today we have the final conference. Partners. As we count, there are about 20 major players at institutional level, practically all municipalities within the 100-kilometer zone, and the municipality of Avarijai, which hosts residents from the Vilnius district municipality. We have a pretty good basis. The state plan for the protection of the population in the event of a nuclear accident, which was improved in 2018. It was the basis for all the preparedness gap assessments. The capacity gap assessment is in a way unique in its methodology, because we did not have a very clear method. We used the questionnaire and tried to find out how the institutions themselves perceive their readiness to implement certain functions within their remit. This is often the result of their self-assessment of whether or not they can do something. This is probably one of the most frequent and largest problems, that not every entity is able to make such a precise self-assessment. For example, colleagues from the Radiation Protection Center may say that they cannot adequately provide a certain function. And how can we check whether they are lying or telling the truth? Therefore, most of the time, everything is based on trust. Well, the kernel plan, as we call it, implements the most relevant IAEA recommendations, in particular GSR Part 7. In principle, the safeguards action zones are not explicitly implemented, not only in Europe, but also worldwide, as we have already seen from all the reports of DG Energy, which, by the way, are now being updated, and we are now working on the relevant questionnaires with Emilis Braškys. In our case, we are following the textbook path and using the safest option. 2019 was the first year of trying to guess how much we are lacking. At that time, we added up the various amounts, and they were really impressive. Some estimates put it around 400 million, while other estimates put it as high as 1 billion. I'm pleased that we have now done a little more work and have come up with other figures. Well, in a sense, we need to keep repeating and remembering the lessons that have already been learned. We are not talking about some imaginary things. We are talking about real things that have happened. And the more we understand and learn from those events and do not repeat the same mistakes, the better we will do. We have benefited to some extent from the 2019 functional exercises. At least in this period of independence, we have worked really hard and sincerely to identify the main potential threats to us from an accident in a neighboring country. I recommend to everyone to keep coming back to this map, to stick a needle in the beginning of that cloud and to imagine that that cloud can spread in all and every direction. Then answer the question, what am I going to do personally? What will my organization do? How will we cooperate with each other at municipal, regional, national, and international level so that we are safe together when this event happens? This website also provides a full list of recommendations. You need to click on each icon, and underneath each one, there are basically answers to 3 questions. What happened? What is important to me? And what do I need to do? Here you see the so-called civil protection cycle. This is also a repetition. As we already know, it all starts with a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is very much dependent on our specific understanding of how some potential minor process violation develops into a major event. And finally, how that event continues to grow in its consequences, depending on the safety barriers we have in place, which we call technical, legal, and organizational measures. This year, we have once again gone a step further with the national risk analysis, and we have made a real effort to make it more informative in order to understand why the different risks are where they are. In terms of the Belarus scenario in particular, we are at code 5.2, which means that we rate it as a very high risk. So what else have we done? I will now show on the slide some of the assumptions and capacity targets related to the nuclear accidents at the Belarus NPP. We have done our best to describe the assumptions and the capacity targets. Without them, we cannot properly plan investments and assess risks. In total, we count
sakykime, visas skirtingų scenarijų mes suskaičiuojam 28.
In total, we count 28 different scenarios. These scenarios can vary considerably in terms of the nature of a hypothetical nuclear accident, and their consequences can vary. While there is sometimes a great deal of overlap in preventive preparedness measures, the scale of the response is different in principle. These investments also show how much more we need to invest in different activities. It is clear from this table that those actors who have been involved in the risk analysis assessment and in the needs assessment are very much focused on preparedness. And that is perhaps not so rational. It would be very good to see a higher proportion of the cost of prevention, or at least some higher proportion. That would mean that we are optimizing our investment in civil protection and risk management. I will not read the assumptions. You can read it for yourself. The scale of the accident, as we imagine it, would be very large indeed. What is most obvious to us is that if we understand and the population understand not as we expect and act adversely, if there is some kind of panic, then the consequences of this event would be significantly greater. What we have already seen in the case of Fukushima, at least from what could be seen, most of the casualties were not due to specific radiation contamination on site, but because people had to evacuate or take other actions without being prepared. This has led to various consequences. We focus in principle on the key capacity objectives described in the National Risk Analysis. We presented it yesterday to all public authorities and municipalities. We expect that discussions on its implementations will be one of the key issues in the next few weeks. We want to ask all civil protection actors to focus on these objectives and to think about what is still lacking, including material resources and procedures, in order to achieve at least these objectives. In principle, the first essential thing is warning and information, followed by iodine prophylaxis, evacuation of the population, sanitation, water supply, surveillance, reporting on samples, and consequently decontamination of the environmental infrastructure and so on. We have more or less already discussed that it will be very important to get specific and clear information about the real danger as early as possible. Therefore, one of the key factors in managing the situation is the efficiency of the surveillance teams and the provision of laboratory findings. What next? We will present the results of the project to DG ECHO. We hope to attend a comitology meeting, the so-called Civil Protection Committee, and present what we have discovered during the investment project. We will also discuss what the EU can do, both at rescue level and at civil protection pool level, to improve the response to emergencies of this scale. There is certainly a lot to talk about on this topic, both in terms of cooperation between EU countries and at the EU level itself. I think one of the more recent issues, which Jonas and his team have been explaining in great detail, is the economic capacity of the member states to respond and prepare for a certain level of emergency. This emergency is such that one country on its own probably cannot be fully prepared. If we look at the consequences over a period of a week, they are still manageable. However, if we considered a long-term perspective, as we see in the cases of Fukushima or Chernobyl, the financial burden is unbearable, not to mention the socio-economic consequences in general. One final highlight is that we have already started planning the budget for 2022. I have been informed that the nearly 18 million allocated to the municipalities within the 100-kilometer zone and to the public authorities have already been practically approved by the government, and the funds are already being planned. I really appreciate your involvement in this event. I hope that the information has been useful for those who are new to it, as well as for those who have already taken the time to read it and have made nearly 100 different comments to Jonas's team. I hope that Jonas will comment on it. I think we are responding very positively to most of the comments. Please do not be offended if some sentence in the investment project does not meet your expectations. Our main objective is to justify the size and the direction of the investment and to show what actually benefits this investment will bring. Thank you. That is what I wanted to say in my introductory statement. I wish you a good event. Let's keep talking. Thank you very much. I give the floor to Jonas. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you see my presentation. I've named it Explorations and Discoveries. The first part will be about the content of our project, about what was done, what we had to do, how we did. The second part of the report will be about what we discovered along the way. The first discovery in this project is our team, which I discovered first, and then we discovered each other, who managed to create in such a short time, just 4 months, what we have created and what we are presenting today. I thank them very much. Also, very important in that project was the kind and attentive communication with our client, mainly with Edgaras. Constant clarification of what is really wanted, what we have to achieve. I'm also grateful to all the institutions that we have met with and discussed with. Your thoughts are also a big part of our project. As Edgaras said in his presentation, we have worked together. What I want to talk about, first a bit about the results of the project. What were the objectives, what were the results, and what is left to do. The second important question is particularly relevant to those institutions that were very active in providing us with questions and suggestions after the seminar. We are very grateful, and I will talk a little bit about how we have taken these comments into account. Well, the third part, which is not very long, but for me the most interesting and unique, is what are the challenges that we have faced and what we have discovered in the project. I will not dwell for long, but our main task, our main objective was to prepare an investment project. It was mainly linked to an assessment of the situation, the existing situation in Lithuania, an assessment of all the institutions that are involved in this activity, including an assessment of their readiness. As has already been mentioned, it was important to assess the missing capacities, that is to say, what is still missing so that we can be prepared to protect our population as much as possible. This project is more focused on the protection of people, of the population, on actions to prevent, as far as possible, illnesses, deaths, etc. It may be a technical and not very interesting question, but I would like to tell you what our 4-month task was. This is the investment project that we prepared and submitted, which is now being translated, and the investment project summaries. You have already received this summary in both English and Lithuanian, and the translation of the whole investment project is now being prepared and will be made available. There were also subtasks, things that we have to take into account in the preparation of the investment project. The first 2 points are more or less clear. This is to give clear measures, to clarify them, and to put them in time. What needs to be done and when? The second subtask is to analyze the problems, assess the existing shortcomings, and carry out a cost-benefit analysis. These are integrated into our investment project. But there were also additional tasks, one of which was to analyze the EU TED database and use it to find purchases that would allow us to price more correctly the measures we intend to implement. Indeed, we did that analysis. It was quite large. Over 1,000 purchases were analyzed. But as far as this database is concerned, we said in our report that it is not the best source, because in these purchases, we often do not find all the data or the information that would allow us to determine prices accurately. We then started to analyze other sources, both those related to the fight against COVID situation and the Lithuanian public procurement databases. We believe that the prices we have quoted for the measures are now based on a wide range of factors and not only on TED. Another task, which has also been difficult in the time available, is the preparation of technical specifications for those measures that we propose to procure, which are the most important. This has also been a major job, which is attached as a separate annex to the investment project. Now we have the result, and it seems to us that it is really good. It is still being analyzed by our customer, and we will have a discussion on the subject. Another task is the assessment of the preparedness of the EU countries for similar accidents, based on one of the European Commission documents, a report. This task was to analyze 10 countries. We decided otherwise, and our experts analyzed the situation in all EU member states. Of course, we took the best things from those countries that most closely matched our situation, that we understood to have the best solutions. And the last task was to analyze the organization and financing of civil protection systems in EU countries. We did not find that detailed funding, even in Lithuania, because there are so many institutions. But we have analyzed in some detail how countries react to accidents that have already occurred, how funding decisions are changed. Additionally, we assessed the country's preparedness for CBRN for accidents. That is the content of our work. On the other hand, what meetings and events have taken place in these 4 months? We divided the project into 3 parts. Firstly, the clarification of the situation, then the drafting of the project, and the third important part is the meetings. We have been making regular reports every 2 weeks, and these showed the progress. There were 5 meetings scheduled with various Lithuanian institutions. Many more took place. We submitted detailed minutes of 6 meetings, but we continue to meet. We are happy that we had a serious meeting with DG ECO at the beginning of the project to set the direction of the project and to find out what the European Commission expects from it. We recently had another meeting to discuss the socio-economic evaluation aspects. We were very pleased that it was basically confirmed that the studies from other countries and from the World Bank, which we have also analyzed, follow similar principles to our project. We have developed our project into 2 strands, which I will briefly describe, and of course the seminar and the final conference that we are attending today. That is the content. About the comments, I won't be able to go into great detail about those answers. We have already prepared a draft version of our response to all 72 comments. 8 institutions have read carefully our investment project and responded to it. It is very pleasing that all the most important and influential institutions have given us their comments. This allowed us to improve the final version of the investment project. We had previously received comments from the customer on our annexes, which we also took into account in the final version of the documents. In fact, the comments can be divided into several groups. The revisions or clarifications have been very helpful, as there were minor inaccuracies which we have corrected. Another part of the comments are opinions. This is very important. In most cases, we could no longer add anything to the report, but in the summary, we expressed our views on the opinions given. 2 types of problems were raised. Some of them are related to our project. Some of the problems are very important and need to be discussed. However, they sometimes occur outside our project framework, especially when it comes to political decisions, or things that are far removed from our investment project. We have not taken into account all the comments, but we have reacted to all of them, and our report will reflect that. Most of the comments were good, relevant, and we have taken them into account in the final version of the document. Now the final steps, what we do at the end of the project. As I said, we are preparing the answers to the authorities' questions. All the institutions will receive them through our customer. You will see our reaction to each of the comments received. The final version of the investment project is already at the printing house. It will soon be sent to our customer in Lithuanian. The investment project and its annexes are now being translated into English. The translation will be done shortly. And then we will have the English version of the investment project. Also, the financial model needs to be reviewed. It works, and I think it can be useful for a variety of challenges, especially in the so-called what-if situations. They can be modeled, and you can see the result with any assumptions, namely what the result of the financial and economic calculation is. I have already talked about this in the seminar. For this project, we have always been working between 2 sides. I wouldn't say they are opposite, but different situations. The first one is kind of clear. That is the investment. It is clear how to measure the benefits of the project if, God forbid, this accident should happen. In fact, those socio-economic benefits are huge, as we will show in our socio-economic benefit assessment report. But what if the accident does not happen? If the accident does not happen, the money will have been spent and not used. Just like insuring your house or apartment. Usually, a fire is very rare, but we nevertheless insure our property every year to give us peace of mind. Because our project is mostly about people, we believe that those investments, those measures are needed to prepare for evacuation, to save lives and health. That is why we really need to invest. And our project specifically identifies those necessary investments. The investment can always be greater. It is always possible to be even safer. You can be insured against almost anything. In Vilnius, it seems to me, you can even insure against a storm at sea. But I do not know if it is worth it. Well, towards the end, challenges and discoveries. The first important thing to note is that this project is an umbrella project. It is not very detailed because the investment is for the entire Lithuanian civil protection system, including a whole range of institutions. In order to realize these investments, individual sub-projects will often need additional justification. Our project is the basis for the next steps. Next, the calculation spreadsheet we have developed. There were two possibilities to use the spreadsheet developed by the Central Project Management Agency, which is the most commonly used calculation sheet for cost-benefit analysis in Lithuania. But after some discussions, we decided to create a separate individual calculation spreadsheet, as the project is certainly not a standard one with various nuances. Therefore, the following calculation sheet was born, and we are happy with it. I think it will be really interesting to our customer and really usable. The next topic is the extension of volumes. We realize that our task in the cost-benefit analysis is to calculate and compare our investment with the socio-economic benefits that those investments can bring. But there are things that are outside the scope of this assessment. These are things that our project and investments do not do. These are the potential impact of the accident on the Lithuanian economy. We have set ourselves the following challenge. We have made a not very precise, not very detailed assessment of the costs to the Lithuanian economy. We discussed this a few weeks ago with the representatives of the Ministry of Energy, who say that not everything has been taken into account. Yes, we acknowledge that it is not possible to take everything into account in the draft project. For example, the change in Lithuania's creditworthiness in the event of an accident. That would require an extremely complex separate study. But we have assessed the impact on the main sectors of the Lithuanian economy. And these figures are also important. Another additional assessment is that of a hypothetical accident. What would the costs and benefits look like, and what would be the indicators if such an accident were to occur? This is part of the cost-benefit analysis. The biggest challenge has been the assessment of socio-economic benefits, because there are two camps, and this was also confirmed to us by the European Commission. One says, let us look at what the socio-economic benefits look like in the event of an accident. And usually, the benefits of many investments are huge, and that is a demonstration of the need to invest. The other camp calls for an assessment of the probability of such an accident, namely an assessment of how likely it is that such an accident will happen, and then multiplying that benefit by the probability. We have calculated both options so that they can be compared. And in the second case, which is the main aspect of the CBA, we got less money, less amounts of money. So the particularities of the probabilistic approach were certainly a challenge of us. We found a lot of literature, but we did not find any similar design study. We were therefore on a rough road compared to the option where such similar cost-benefit analysis would have been carried out. So assumptions were very numerous. In reality, a great many things affect the outcome. The size of the accident, the number of inhabitants through whose homes the cloud will pass, the size of the investment, and etc. There are many parameters, and these parameters, as the sensitivity analysis shows, change the results substantially. So too, the challenge that we are now facing is that of a sensitivity analysis or what-if analysis, where we can look at the results or the consequences of each possible solution. My time is coming to an end on this presentation. I have a few more thoughts. I wanted to say more about the benefits of the investment project, but I will limit myself to the fact that our investment project has created the basis for the necessary steps once the situation has been analyzed and the solutions have been presented and justified. It is not a final result that can be implemented from A to Z. It is a basis for future steps for other projects that will reinforce the impact. I've put a quote from my favorite person, Steve Jobs, at the end. We have already laughed about it at the project. He said, because the ones who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones that do. When we started this project with our team, we felt a bit crazy, wading into a river with an unfamiliar current and bottom. But I'm so glad we did it. It seems to me that with this project, we are going to change the world a little bit. Finally, I would like to reiterate the point that Edgaras made at the beginning of his presentation. Together, that complexity and joint work are very important in this activity, working together. If one of the institutions implements what is envisaged in our investment project, there will be no result. If at least one of the institutions does not implement what is foreseen in the project, the result will also be incomplete, and the whole system may not work. So I wish all those who are listening to this seminar to continue together to implement the ideas that have emerged from the investment project and to develop new ideas. I hope and believe that our people will be as safe as possible after the implementation of the planned investments. Thank you. We will now have a very interesting presentation. It is analysis of the level of preparedness for nuclear and radiological emergencies in the EU member states, conclusions and recommendations by our quasi-foreign expert, Povilas Vaišnys, who has been working in Austria recently and in various countries all over the world. I think it will be very interesting. Povilas, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. There is a lot of information, despite the fact that these are conclusions and recommendations. We have already presented the analysis in more detail in the workshop and in our project documentation. I will therefore go straight to my presentation without preamble. I'll start with the report on which we based our analysis and tell you why and how we did it. Following the Fukushima accident, an EU-initiated review of the emergency preparedness of the countries of the European Community was carried out, the results of which are set out in the NR report, the cover of which you can see on the left. NR is the Commission's directorate responsible for energy, which was precisely responsible for preparing this review. Within the framework of this investment project, which we are now discussing, the results of the NR study were analyzed in the areas of emergency preparedness that were identified in the NR report as the highest priority, where the problems were identified, and it was interesting to see how these problems were being addressed in one or other European country. It was also to find out what experience would be useful for us in the context of Lithuania's national plan for the Belarusian NPP and where those findings and recommendations would be useful in the design of this investment project. It also took into account which areas have the greatest impact on the demand for human, material, financial, and intellectual resources in nuclear emergency preparedness planning. I have to say that this area, which is linked to resources, was not developed in the NR report because it was not intended to reveal this direction. We therefore had to go through the findings of this report in a rather complex way so that we could learn from indirect information how these resources are planned in the various European countries, what criteria are used. And we have done that. The next slide shows the areas that we have selected for our analysis to address the issues formulated in our investment project. From the emergency planning zones, which have a huge impact on the planning of emergency preparedness resources, to the technical assistance measures, which are really essential for the realization of emergency preparedness tasks. I will start with the emergency planning zones. These are the areas around the nuclear facility whose threat we are analyzing, and where certain protective actions have to be carried out, depending on the criteria set. Obviously, the emergency planning zones have the greatest impact on the demand for resources. The smaller the size of the zone, the smaller the resource reserves required for emergency preparedness purposes. What conclusion can we draw from this table that presents the various boundaries? First, a rather trivial conclusion. The emergency planning zones established by the EU countries vary considerably. The reasons why they differ so much are also quite trivial. If we look at the algorithm for establishing emergency planning zones, it is quite simple. It has three components: the scenarios of foreseeable accidents, which are precisely what form the radioactive source, which is further analyzed in the form of a radioactive cloud, taking into account the dispersion conditions. The second component is the weather conditions that affect the subsequent forwarding of the cloud over large distances. And the third component is the established radiation dose criteria, which are critical in determining the boundaries of these emergency planning zones. The differences in the boundaries of the emergency planning zones, which you have seen in the table in the previous slide, they mean that all three of these components are treated differently in different countries. Different scenarios for predicted accidents, different material conditions ranging from normal to average to worst. We will talk about this later, because it is also the headache of the European Commission. The criteria for radiation dose protective actions. All these differences in the treatment of these three components of emergency planning zoning are precisely what led to the differences we have already seen in the table. Looking at this table, we should draw another conclusion. We could not fit all 28 countries in the table, but the ones that have been shown can be divided into two parts, according to the concepts used in the planning of the emergency planning zones. What are these concepts? The first is deterministic. Lithuania is also included in this concept. What is it? It means that the emergency planning zones are defined according to international recommendations, requirements, I mean IAEA recommendations, or recommended ranges. The second concept is pragmatic, or an optimistic, optimizing approach to the establishment of emergency planning zones. The deterministic concept is quite clear. Taking into account the IAEA recommendations, we set those limits that are recommended. As for the second approach, the pragmatic concept, I have to go back to the table to look at the UK's implementation of the concept, because that is the one which is best demonstrating the second approach. As you can see, this is an exceptional example because the evacuation zone is exceptionally small compared with the emergency planning zones in other countries. Why is that? Without looking in detail at all the assumptions, the logic of this concept is this. There is what is called detailed planning, where needs and resources are planned in detail to cope with emergencies that can be realistically assessed. Obviously, one cannot ignore the low probability emergency situations in the case of severe accidents. Their probability is low, but the consequences can be catastrophic. Therefore, when defining the boundaries of the emergency planning zones, we must take into account the low probability accident, and this is not realized within the framework of detailed planning, but within the framework of what is known as strategy. What does this mean? It means forming a short-range emergency planning area where we plan and prepare the needs in detail and prepare a strategy to mobilize the necessary resources in the event of a low probability emergency situation.
Kaip mobilizuoti reikiamus resursus, jeigu tokia situacija įvyks.
This is the logic behind the concept. Now let us look at Lithuania. If we look at this situation, we can see that in the Lithuanian state plan, the emergency planning zones for both the Ignalina NPP and the Belarusian NPP are the same, which is 30 kilometers. In fact, they do not correspond to the threats. The current threat from the Ignalina NPP is different compared to the projected threat from the Belarusian NPP. This conclusion is obvious, and we recommend that the Lithuanian state revise the boundaries of the emergency planning zones established in the plan and validates, revises, and justifies the 30-kilometer zone established for the Belarus NPP. Another area we have analyzed is the early warning and the radiation monitoring system. The purpose of this system is to signal the risk of a nuclear accident and to provide a first-draft assessment of the radiological situation. The number of gamma monitoring systems varies from country to country, from a few units to several thousands. Some non-nuclear countries, namely the countries without nuclear power plants, such as Italy, have several thousand such monitoring systems, and Austria have several hundred. The number of radiation monitoring stations is not a basis for assessing which country is better prepared for an emergency. A better characteristic is their density. It is therefore important to optimize the monitoring system so that the density is as high as possible when approaching the nuclear facility. For which the radiation threat is being analyzed. On the other hand, since radiation spectrometry is a very effective tool in the monitoring system, it would be very useful to have radiation spectrometry instruments not only in central laboratories, also in Lithuania, but as close to the border as possible in our case. This is because spectrometry allows the composition of radioactive emissions to be determined, which then determine the subsequent dose to the population. As regards the optimization of the monitoring system, there have been no standards to date that can be used to determine the density of monitoring stations. However, we have found recent information that Norway has developed requirements for the density of such monitoring system stations. This information is very interesting, and it seems to me that Lithuania could also benefit from it. Another interesting factor that we would like to draw attention to, and on the basis of which we have come to a conclusion, is that it is very useful for Lithuania to trace the situation that exists in that reactor. In our case, in the Belarusian NPP reactor, in the event of an accident. Given the situation that has arisen between Belarus and Lithuania in the area of bilateral cooperation, it would be very appropriate with the results of the monitoring to look at what is happening in the Belarusian NPP reactor. Several countries are already using this methodology. Means how on the basis of so-called inverse modeling it is possible to look at the reactor that we want to defend ourselves against. Some interference. I'm sorry, I mean, there are 10 minutes left. The general criteria for protective action are set out below. Someone needs to turn off the microphone. I'm so sorry, I don't know what is wrong. If we look at the general criteria for protective action, they also vary widely. This is one of the problems that the European Commission is facing and trying to solve. The criteria for protective actions have a major impact on human health. Their variation from country to country is a source of public and political concern. There have been attempts to address this issue for a long time. The European Commission has taken various steps to harmonize, to unify these criteria across European countries. As we can see from the conclusions, the results so far are not promising. Although there are examples in Europe where this problem is being addressed in individual regions. For example, in Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, there is a great deal of work being done to harmonize these criteria. The report itself recommends that the European Commission should prepare a document at political level, a standard or other document, which sets out a Europe-wide harmonized framework for the identification of emergency planning zones and criteria for the implementation of protective measures, since the criteria for protective actions are precisely what determine the boundaries of these emergency planning zones. When we talk about a strategy for protective actions, we mean how to carry out protective measures. Which is better, sheltering or evacuation? Which is more effective? Even with regard to iodine prophylaxis, which seems to be the obvious protective measure, but here too European countries have different approaches. In most European countries, it is used as a standalone protective measures, but independent from other measures. But 5 countries consider that iodine prophylaxis should only be used in conjunction with sheltering. In the case of evacuation of the population, most countries consider it appropriate only until the release or emission of radioactive substances. It is good if we have information that such emission is possible or foreseeable. But what if there is no such information? Lithuania takes the same position that evacuation should be before the emission. But the question is, does Lithuania have the necessary information before the emission? It all depends on the communication with the country with a nuclear risk. A very sensitive area is cross-border arrangements. We have already talked a lot about it. The aspects of cross-border arrangements are, first of all, initial warning and follow-up information on how the situation is evolving in the reactor itself, which is a source of nuclear risk. Timely and comprehensive information that enables effective protective action to be taken. The ENER report identifies cross-border arrangements as one of the priority areas for emergency preparedness. It is explicitly stated that although the problem is less acute among European countries, the need to improve cross-border arrangements with Russia and Belarus is stressed. I would like to say that Lithuania has already reacted to this recommendation. An agreement has emerged with Belarus on early warning and exchange of information. However, we have analyzed this agreement, and it is a framework agreement. It must be based on specific working procedures that define who, when, how, and to what extent information exchange is to be implemented in specific emergency conditions. There are many examples of cross-border arrangements in Europe. We have mentioned earlier, one of the best examples is Austrian-Czech cooperation in the event of an accident. It is an example not only from a technical point of view, but also because this technical cooperation was implemented at the highest political level. Despite the contradictions between the Czech Republic and Austria on the construction of the Temelin NPP, when it was built finally, an agreement was reached at the highest political level to realize the situation illustrated on the slide, where all the data in the Czech Republic, including the monitoring system and information on the reactor, are made available in a database in Austria. The medical field is very important. What you see in green is medical fields that those are in compliance with the medical or emergency medical services requirements. The situation is quite good, except that one of the nuclear countries, Slovakia, does not have the possibility to provide special treatment for radiation victims. We have one recommendation in this area. It would be very useful to analyze in the emergency planning area, 30-kilometer zone, the capacity of healthcare and other social care institutions that could be used in case of an emergency, and whether they are enough. It would be good to have medical personnel and equipment ready in the area so that they can be used without the need to gather teams, medical teams from central areas of Lithuania. It would be good to implement such an analysis. Technical assistance measures are necessary and help emergency centers to make decisions. As regards the situation in most European countries, it is possible to assess the dispersion of radioactive substances in the atmosphere, but the focus is more on the dispersion of radioactive substances in the atmosphere than in the water environment. Lithuania is different in this respect, as it has very good possibilities to predict the dispersion of radioactive substances in freshwater environment. However, this another report of the European Commission found that the capacity to assess the forwarding of radioactive substances on land surface was insufficient. Most countries do not have software tools to predict this direction. The analysis of the overall situation in European countries has highlighted the problems that European countries face in implementing the objectives required for emergency preparedness. Recommendations have been made on how existing capabilities or capacities in individual European countries can be optimized and planned in a way that allows for a better sharing of resources and capabilities and capacities available in European countries. Jonas Stravinskas had already mentioned that they need to think carefully before deciding to plan the detailed requirements for low probability emergencies in all countries. We need to have a good consideration before such decisions. Final overall conclusions and recommendations. This time I will say nothing about part 1 of the Erner report, which compares European countries' compliance with international requirements in theory. All the countries seem to be in perfect compliance with the IAEA requirements or the European Commission directives. But I have already tried to show that when we analyze how these requirements are treated and implemented in the real situation, which is what really determines the reality of emergency preparedness, we can see how different the situation is in the various European countries. The conclusions state that the boundaries of emergency planning zones, including in Lithuania, must be justified. It is not enough to have a 30-kilometer boundary in accordance with the IAEA requirements. Even these requirements stipulate that any such emergency planning zone must be validated by a specific analysis of the site in respect of which we are predicting radiation aggression. Therefore, in the Republic of Lithuania, it would be appropriate to carry out a detailed analysis of the validation of the emergency planning zones based on the design data of the specific reaction. It is also necessary to address the issue of cross-border arrangements. It is very difficult to imagine a specific accident and specific actions without detailed information on the real actual situation at the reactor which imposes the threat. In the preparation of emergency preparedness plans, a decision has to be taken on what is appropriate to plan in detail and where an appropriate strategy can be developed to mobilize the necessary resources in the event of a low-probability accident. Emergency preparedness plans in European countries need to be regularly reviewed and evaluated by independent experts to make sure that existing emergency planning tools and capabilities are in line with the scale of the emergency threat and with the international practice. The last conclusions or recommendations are implemented in Lithuania. Nuclear emergency preparedness plans are an integral part of the overall emergency management system. However, this is not the case in other countries, including the European Commission. Therefore, this integration of individual situations into a single emergency management system. Thank you, and I'm very sorry for going over time. Thank you, dear Mr. Povilas. You have some reserve.
Tam tikrą rezervą. Ir kitaip tariant,
I think that your experience and your age oblige us to respect your time over ours. We accept everything you have said. At the beginning of the event, we asked all participants to be patient and wait until 12:30. And we can then arrange the discussion. Mr. Povilas' presentation is very controversial and topical and hits the nail on the head. I say this because I can see that Ms. Ramune, the head of the Radiation Protection Center, has something to say. Ramune, we really do not want to cause too much of a stir. I would ask you to be very brief in your comment, and we will have more discussion at 12:30. I will just say my comment. we reiterate our request to take into account the general comments we made on this part of emergency preparedness. If the people who prepared project had any uncertainties, they could have been clarified. We do not agree with many of the proposals. I'm not only referring to the Radiation Protection Center, but I believe that other institutions also share this view. They are unbalancing the system, and many of the proposals that Mr. Povilas has made already exist in Lithuania, and they are being implemented. Therefore, I think that the Fire and Rescue Department, as the customer, should once again critically evaluate certain proposals. Thank you. Thank you, Ramune, for this comment. I hope that anyone else who has any suggestions or questions to ask will be able to post them via the chat function, and I certainly invite you to come to the debate at 12:30, where I hope all the speakers will be able to give their reasoned answers. Now it is Renata's turn, a very comprehensive report. As always, Renata, the floor is yours. My topic is about the alternatives of the investment project and the assessment of their implementation. In my presentation, I will give a brief overview of the process of developing alternatives, the criteria for evaluating the measures, and the alternatives proposed and developed during the investment project. First of all, the most interesting question is how the alternatives to the investment project, which are described in the project, were formulated. The overall process of generating the alternatives was quite simple. A long list of investment measures was drawn up. These measures were grouped into categories. The criteria for evaluating the measures were established, and they were evaluated, after which a short list of measures was drawn on the basis of this. And the quantities and prices of the measures were established. The long list of investment measures is a list of measures needed to prepare for an accident at the Belarusian NPP. We did not start it from a blank sheet of paper. The basis for this list, as Edgaras has already mentioned, was the Fire and Rescue Department plan for the needs for the preparation of state institutions and municipalities for a possible radiological or nuclear accident at the Belarusian NPP. The plan was launched in 2019 on the basis of the identified needs sent by the authorities. Also, during the preparation of this IP, various institutions have been refining their measures, lists, and needs. And the measures were proposed by our team and also included into the list. The long list of measures was further divided into groups according to the function of the state plan for population protection. This resulted in 15 groups, the names of which I will not read, but which clearly reflect the functions. For example, early warning and gamma monitoring measures, public warning and information measures, measures to ensure the evacuation of the population, and so on. The criterion for the grouping was the specificity of the functions. The measures were further evaluated. The evaluation criteria and results are presented in the project. You can see them in detail. I would like to mention that any qualitative evaluation or assessment is quite subjective. There may be different opinions, but our team, after much discussion, has evaluated the measures exactly as stated in the investment project. What are those criteria? The first priority criterion evaluated measures according to the overall impact of the measure on the implementation of the state plan. The overall impact on the implementation of the project, the impact on human health and life. The second criterion was more weighted and scored to the measures that mitigate the consequences of an accident at the Belarusian NPP closer to the potential accident site, within the planning area of the emergency protective actions. Other measures were scored slightly lower accordingly. Under the criterion of impact on human health and life, the assessment was clearly whether the measure has a direct impact, whether it is simply has an impact, or whether it is intended to have an impact or has no impact on human health and life. Under the principle of accessibility, the assessment was whether the measures are readily available on the market. The principle of universality assessed whether a measure that is in principle intended for the management of a nuclear emergency can be assessed in other emergencies. And the last criterion, consistency with the government's strategic planning documents, gave extra points to instruments or measures that are consistent with these documents. The assessment resulted in a short list, which is the short list of measures necessary for the preparedness. I would like to stress that the measures not included in this list are redundant or less important. They can simply be acquired in other ways, outside the framework of this investment project. To summarize, I can say that the list does not include measures that are already planned, funded, or under implementation. Measures that can be obtained through other mechanisms of mobilization of material resources, for example, provision of food, drinking water, hygiene, sanitation measures to the evacuated population. They are not included. While these are very important, it would be probably not be very smart to invest in such measures in advance. Also excluded are items which are necessary for the normal operation and continuity of the institution, and which can be purchased from the budget appropriations allocated to the institution. Investments in short-list measures became one of the alternatives for the investment project. A total of 3 alternatives were considered. Alternative 0, with no project investments, Alternative 1, with substantial short-list investments, and Alternative 2, with optimization of short-list investments. I will now briefly discuss them. Alternative 0, business as usual, where we do nothing or buy nothing. But this does not mean that the functions set out in the state plan for the protection of population are not carried out. They would be carried out to the best of their ability in accordance with the existing state and municipal emergency management plans in place, including civil protection system resources. In short, the civil protection system has not gone anywhere. Some of the resources needed to deal with this particular emergency are certainly available, but the means are lacking. The investment needs summary counted more than 92 million euro in missing or lacking assets. We can therefore conclude and state that the organization of the protection of the population in the event of a nuclear accident at the Belarusian NPP may not be possible or very chaotic. The project itself describes the consequences of the alternative zero in more detail. The main problems would arise from the lack of the dosimetric monitoring devices, the lack of personal protective equipment, insufficient human and technical sanitation capacities, and potentially unreliable early warning system. Therefore, such an alternative would be unacceptable. How it would look in a diagram. This is a very general diagram. I don't know if you can see my cursor. What does an unreliable system mean? It means that deteriorating radiation monitoring stations need to be replaced and may not detect increases in background radiation in time. Inadequate sanitation capacities, those red flags, lack of dosimetric monitoring devices would allow radiation contamination to spread in uncontaminated areas. The lack of personal protective equipment would make the work of the staff organizing the protection of the population difficult, if not impossible. And the evacuation, which is indicated by the blue arrows, would therefore be chaotic. And the orange arrows indicate the spread of pollution. The evacuation would therefore become unmanageable, and people would have nowhere to stay after leaving the contaminated area, because the collective protection structures would not be equipped to accommodate the population and the necessities of life. Such a situation could lead to a national crisis, and this is not acceptable. Let's now turn to alternative 1, where investments are made in the measures of the shortlist. This can be called the optimistic alternative. It would cost Lithuania more than 57 million euro, but it would provide the material resources necessary for preparedness, including a modern new radiation monitoring system to detect changes in the radiation background in a timely manner, and collective protection structures adapted to the reception of the population, as well as the sanitation capacities available in each of the affected municipalities. But, however, there is a but to all these fine phrases. The optimistic alternative has some drawbacks. The figure below shows that the amount of sanitation equipment available to all municipalities may well prove to be excessive, especially since even in the event of a major accident, the contamination will not cover the entire emergency planning area or the entire extended planning area. Therefore, such equipment will only be needed in a specific area. This would lead to a situation where some measures would be redundant and they might lacking in the area we need, as storage is decentralized and the measures are scattered in different municipalities, and deployment would be quite complicated. Unreliable early warning means that replacing an existing RADI system with a new modern system may cause some problems during the replacement period. Incompatibilities may arise because there will be a period of time, perhaps not very long, when one system would already be unusable and the other system not yet sufficiently ready. These are minor drawbacks that have led to more optimized solutions. Alternative 2 is what we think is needed because it meets all the good features of Alternative 1. It optimizes the quantities of equipment needed and ensures a more efficient use of equipment at a lower financial, time and organizational cost. It would cost Lithuania more than 27 million euro. It is also the more financially viable option, but that is not the main point. The quantities of the measures would be sufficient and the use would be rational. Replacement and renovation of the existing GRADI stations, collective protection structures adapted to hosting of the population, the necessary equipment to meet the population's basic needs, sufficient quantities of sanitation equipment, and pollution control. All of this would make it possible to achieve the objectives of the project. Comparing the alternatives considered, it is clear that we propose to choose Alternative 2, which ensures the preparation for a possible accident at the Belarusian NPP at the lowest cost and with the best outcome. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ms. Renata. Actually, I will joke, and I apologize if my jokes are not always very polite in this case. I was reminded of the Lithuanian television program, The Style, when Ms. Renata was very intelligent, calm, and positive about presenting the preparedness issues. Thank you very much. We now move on to a very intense presentation by Vygandas. I think he has prepared some interesting technical details which usually attract the attention of the male audience. Vygandas, over to you. Hello. You have presented my presentation very intriguingly about the technical details. It has to be acknowledged that accidents involving nuclear materials or substances are very multifaceted and cannot be managed without preparation in advance. Also, with regard to the preparation of the investment project, it must be acknowledged that it is a very good thing that the homework has already been done in Lithuania, which has made it much easier and simpler for us to take those technical decisions without much discussion. I'm referring to the standard sheets of equipment drawn up by the Fire and Rescue Department. And finally, let us not be scared by the experience of the 2019 exercise and the lessons we have learned. It has been very inspiring and at the same time has led to a more open conversation with many institutions. I would like to thank all those who helped, assisted and corrected. I have certainly taken a lot of your time, but I think it will be helpful to you in the future as well. Very briefly, what we will talk about: how the assessment went, what solutions exist in other countries, what we have tried to offer from a technical point of view, not organizational, not legal, but technical. What challenges did we see and encounter, and because an investment project must provide measures to overcome those challenges, also those measures from the technical side will be presented. As already mentioned above, the initial information we received from the customer the department was very helpful. It has been summarized and organized in different sections. It therefore facilitated our initial discussions. We have interviewed all the institutions again, trying to assess their needs and possibilities. We had a number of meetings. Although at the very end of the project, we are really grateful for the opportunity to have access to the draft national risk analysis, which contains quite useful information. And some of the assumptions have been very useful to us. I also had a lot of interest in the organization of preparedness abroad. We have to recognize, as Povilas has already said, that there are many different approaches, many different ways of preparedness. I can say that no country has dared to say that they are fully prepared. There are stronger factors and weaknesses or areas for improvement everywhere. We can all imagine that work in an emergency situation would start roughly as shown in the photo. Here is a photo from the Chernobyl accident, at least it is said so. Nowadays, there are dozens of times more vehicles and not enough resources to carry out such a sanitation. On the other hand, this makes it easier for the population to self-evacuate, but on the other hand, there are a lot of problems in the case of alternative zero mentioned by Renata. If we did nothing, many people would move out of the contaminated area and the pollution would spread widely and abundantly. We certainly do not want that. We all understand that this would not be a positive solution. As there is very little experience in dealing with the consequences of an accident, we are talking about Fukushima, we are talking about Chernobyl, but it has to be acknowledged that the Chernobyl accident happened 30 years ago. And Japan, where Fukushima is situated, is a very peculiar country with a very peculiar culture, where there is community and public obedience and strong self-preservation skills. They live in an earthquake zone, and they do not even question the howling or the sirens as a need for an active response. We had to admit that we did not really find a single correct approach. I emphasize single correct approach to emergency preparedness, and we had to take decisions and make solutions on possible alternatives. When analyzing the civil protection preparedness and transformation of the EU countries after certain events, it had to be acknowledged that in recent years there has been a recognition in many countries that certain specialized resources need to be acquired centrally. Not only must resources be procured, but it must also be foreseen who will use them. In the past, it has been trendy to leave a lot of matters to the municipal level. However, experience has shown that municipalities do not have the human resources to make good and adequate use of the resources available. All solutions have been evaluated in the preparation of the technical proposals, which are needed to prepare adequately for a complex solution. In the previous picture, we saw one person. Now we see two people washing the vehicle. But this is really just a visual illustration of the need to minimize the number of people where machinery can work, where it should work. In the case of a radiation accident, everything must be done as quickly as possible. Even the national risk analysis sets a challenge to evacuate people from a 30-kilometer zone within 3 hours. From a logistic point of view, this would be a huge challenge for which we must be prepared and plan. Renata talked about the principles that guided the choice of measures in general, whether it is useful or not, required or not. For the technical specifications, we have drawn up 40 different specifications so that each institution did not have to prepare them separately and wonder if funds and wonder what is necessary if they got funds. Some of the measures can be adapted to several institutions. Some specifications are very specific, almost one-off, but unique and necessary. This is the principle of universality. Now, unification. We received proposals from institutions as to what tools and equipment they would like. After discussions, we agreed that, for example, a digital dosimeter could be used by a fireman, a policeman, and even a municipal employee organizing hosting or evacuation of population. This would reduce costs and facilitate handling and training. The possibility of rapid deployment was very important. In the case of radiation emergencies, the first few hours are very important, and there is more time afterwards to make decisions. Therefore, when describing the measures, they are chosen so that they can be used as quickly as possible. Compatibility with existing equipment and tools. Renata has already mentioned that nothing stands still. The department and the municipalities are in the process of procurement. We have therefore tried to assess, where possible, what has already been purchased or is planned for this year, to make the measures as compatible as possible, or even similar, if our team of experts believes that they are logical, good solutions. Procurement competition meant that we had to look more closely into the history of Lithuanian procurement, as Jonas has said. I have to admit that the Central Contracting Authority has been making quite good purchases recently in terms of safeguards in the fight against COVID. I think that at national level, some of the organizational issues could be dealt with by a single contracting authority, and the other institutions would then benefit from the administrative work they have done. Because the administration of public procurement also requires both money and time. When it comes to efficient use, it must be acknowledged that the desire is always to be fast, good, and cheap. But unfortunately, in reality, only two of these three options are possible at the same time. If we want to clean and sanitize people quickly and cheaply, it is not going to be very efficient. And if we want to sanitize people well and quickly, then it will not be the cheapest option. There has been a lot of debate, both internally and externally, trying to determine which would be the best and most necessary criterion and option. I will repeat myself again, but our main technical solutions, where we see an opportunity to use the funds more efficiently, are the use of mobile sanitation stations with the possibility of using them and storing them in certain areas rather than in every municipality, because no one can say for sure on which day an accident will occur and what the wind will blow that day. As a result, the fixed posts or stations that have been set up may be inoperable or may not be located in the evacuation directions that are needed. Similarly, existing infrastructure should be exploited. It is not to be imagined that to this day we have nothing in place. Municipal emergency management centers have been in place for 10 years. I have never seen people there sitting just simply on a stool and doing nothing. We need to reinforce and get well prepared, but let's not assume that we will start from scratch. As regards the proposed optimization solutions, I will reiterate what I think would be useful for all people involved, including foreign colleagues. For example, in the preparation of the technical specifications, Jonas has already mentioned that the EU STET database purchases were analyzed. It was not only the money that was looked at, but also what equipment, what tools, what measures are being purchased, what requirements are being set, as far as possible. I'm not saying that we did a copy-paste approach, but we looked at specific things. The specifications are not the cheapest and the simplest ones, but they are well thought through, and they are based on the principle of multifunctionality. As far as nuclear accident recovery is concerned, we have to remember that such accidents are very rare. Jonas has already mentioned it, and maybe Darius will also talk about the probability of an accident happening. However, I would like to say that means when they are purchased, they may just remain in storage and not be used. I will contradict to that. If the level of equipment is acquired as we are planning, it is perfectly capable of being used in the event of any accident involving radiation and radiology. The COVID situation has shown that those countries that were more prepared for chemical or nuclear emergencies did equip themselves with protective equipment and disposables in the first period, in the initial period. And this was much easier for them than for those countries that had not stockpiled such equipment. We had to strike a balance so that we did not offer to buy a very versatile item, which automatically raises the price and the maintenance costs. Another important thing that we have discussed a lot, both internally and externally, is the measures that are fitted to certain instruments, such as sanitation stations and population collection and distribution points, so that they work properly. It is not enough just to bring the equipment in and set it up, but we must think that in a few hours' time, we will have to change protective suits, tanks, and so on. We know from life experience that in the first hours of an emergency, information provision and logistics are not very well established. Let us be honest with ourselves and think in advance about how we can deal with this issue, especially given that most of these measures will be applied in municipalities, which often do not have the human resources to deal with everything. In this case, advanced preparation and semi-modular staffing would help to improve the first response and ensure that as many people as possible are evacuated or sanitized. We have also paid great attention to early warning. As Povilas has already mentioned, even if the source of the threat is very close to our border, it is very likely that we will see visually first that something has happened before we receive a notification from our neighbors, at least according to the situation that is nowadays. That is why early warning is so important for us. So what are the challenges? Centralized procurement of equipment is difficult due to the large volumes involved. Once the equipment has been purchased, staff need to be trained to use it. It is necessary to foresee where the equipment will be stored and how it will be delivered, so that it is a logical and not too lengthy solution. The organization and coordination of the work is essential in every case, as is the maintenance and disposal of the equipment. All of these issues would look something like this to an ordinary municipal specialist. We thought about how we could make this task easier. As I said, we should centralize the purchase of equipment when it comes to uniform personal protective equipment, respiratory protective equipment, and etc. With a few exceptions, they would be used in the same way in practically all cases. The investment project provides funds for in-house staff training and interagency training, as well as for functional exercises. After the conclusions of the 2019 exercise, we were able to speak more openly, more clearly, without beating about the bush, how everything is not as good as we would like to. The sooner we admit this honestly, the better prepared we will be. Some measures need constant maintenance. There have been cases where expensive equipment is not being used because it has not been maintained on time. Metrological tests have not been carried out, etc. In this case, too, the investment project funds are earmarked for this. As Jonas has already said, it is very important to understand that only the consistent implementation and financing of the entire project will ensure effectiveness. I have to say that not everything is provided for. These are the funds for storage, transport, disposal, because this is very much dependent on the instrument and measures that are purchased. The presentation sounded very intriguing, but I have tried to make it very brief. Thank you. Thank you, Vygandas. Indeed, all details, reports, or other interesting things are important. And I invite all the participants to watch the video afterwards to get a better understanding of what was said. The last presentation I want to introduce, perhaps repeating myself a little, it is a presentation of Jonas and Darius. They will be presenting something quite new, especially for civil protection professionals, because often we see some needs from our perspective. We know that we need money for a fire engine, for a dosimeter, for a leaky hose, or for bad shoes. What we really need is money to live or to invest, with the understanding that we need to have the resources to help people. It is our understanding and approach that we have a role to play in times of trouble. And when we look at the national level, we have a common view of all the problems. And today we stand in the same queue with teachers, doctors, and other equally important professions. They all need investments. They all talk about the benefits and needs they create. And we do not necessarily want to be first all the time. Public thinking would help us too. Those who create more value and those whose needs are critical for the state at the moment should be left out and prioritized. Seeing and putting the queue in order is also a kind of language that our colleagues Darius and Jonas have mastered. I give them the floor, and I hope that their language will also help us to better understand our place in the queue and help the leaders of the state to make the right decisions.
Over to you.
Thank you, Edgaras. The financial and economic assessment is the translation of everything that has been said so far to money, taking into account two aspects. The financial aspect, that is to say, the money that we see, which is very clear, and the economic, which is an overall expression of the impact of our investments in a very broad sense. I would like to say that this is the last but not least presentation, which will consist of two parts. First, I will briefly try to explain what financial and economic assessment are and how they differ from each other. This is very important for everyone involved in this system to understand. Then I will discuss the financial assumptions and results. These are things that are easy to understand and visible, expressed in monetary terms. The next issue, which is the most interesting and which has generated the most discussion in our team and will perhaps be discussed in the future, is economic assumptions and results. And Darius will then talk about the results of sensitivity analysis, which factors have the biggest impact on economic outcomes, and how to test different sets of assumptions and their impact on the outcome. And finally, we will conclude with an example that we have further calculated, which means an illustration of the extent of costs. In fact, only part of the cost will be assessed. It is possible to take a very broad view, but we have focused on the impact on economic sectors in the case of an accident. These are the 5 parts of the presentation. The purpose of assessment in the context of cost-benefit analysis is to assess whether the benefits generated by the investment outweigh the costs incurred in carrying out the project. These are the benefits that are dispersed throughout the country, if not more widely, and that must make up for the investment that the state will make. And some basic principles now. After this seminar, we were asked to explain them more simply and clearly. Well, it is not very easy to do. What does discounted cash flow means? We look at the impact of our investments over a 15-year perspective. To see the current benefit, the flows are discounted, which means the benefit and the 15-year investment are brought together into one figure, what the current benefits is, and these are compared. This is the approach. Next, incremented approach. Thinking about our project, this means that we are comparing alternative 0, business as usual, as Renata said, with the alternatives when we invest. The result of our project is the difference in benefits between the decision we take and the business as usual decision. Our investment brings some impact on economic and financial cash flows. The third issue is very basic. The comparison between financial and economic assessment. In the financial assessment, everything is seen in actual money. Whereas in the economic assessment, we look at things that are further away from our project. It is the most important aspect of this approach, because the state is investing and there is no return on money. When we insure a house and no disaster happens for a year, We are just spending money. It is the finances that show the cost of insurance, and the economics shows what can happen if there is an accident. Now, briefly about the alternatives. Alternative 1, 57 million investment, is the first step described by Renata. This is the size to achieve all the objectives. As has already been mentioned, in the first step we have planned all investments. In fact, at the beginning there was a list of measures which cost 92 million. We have gone back on it, added our own ideas and dropped some investments off. In the first step, we get a package that solves the problems. Alternative 2 is optimized investment. We looked at the quantity and quality of investments, and we could have optimized some things. The investments were reduced to the 28 million necessary for the project to achieve its objectives. The other investments that have already been mentioned are also good and important, but sometimes they are a bit too high and produce little benefit in relation to the amount invested. Here is a list of who the beneficiaries will be if we choose alternative 2, which is the most important for us. We assessed the benefits of the financial assumptions and results over a 15-year period. We have also considered the fact that the residual value of certain assets remains after 15 years. We have also assumed reinvestment, and the financial discount rate is a kind of rate of return that allows us to estimate and calculate the net present value. Some parameters comparing alternatives 1 and 2. The incremental size of the investment is shown in 2 columns. It is called incremental because there are investments without the project which are not assessed here. We are only looking at incremental investments related to the project. Next, maintenance. Vygantas has already mentioned how important it is to prepare the equipment for proper storage, how important it is to learn and to train how to use it. Each piece of equipment and asset in itself generates certain costs, which accumulate over 15 years and are quite high for the different alternatives. There is another set of costs that is quite specific. These costs will not be incurred unless there is an accident, but we as a country are prepared to evacuate people. These are the costs associated with sanitation, cleaning, decontamination, and removal of people and their accommodation in other places. Those costs are interesting because they do not exist if there is no accident. If there is an accident, we need to be ready quickly to carry out those actions for which the costs are only needed after the accident. The comparison between the 2 alternatives also gives the numbers of workers or people involved in the process. A large number of people will have to be involved in the process of rescuing the population in the event of an accident. In the last slide of finance, we see that the financial indicators are negative. This goes without saying. Every professional understands that investing in such a project does not generate any income. Financially, it is a cost that is expressed in negative figures. Both alternatives have negative financial indicators, which means that are only spending, but our money comes back in socio-economic benefits, which Darius will tell about, who has analyzed this aspect in great depth. Hello. Following on from Jonas's presentation, in financial analysis, we are talking about live money that we spend and do not receive any income or financial benefit. So both alternatives were just expenses, one with higher amounts and the other with lower. When we talk about economic or socio-economic benefits or impact assessment, we are trying to measure the benefits in other aspects, more broadly than just in terms of live money or finance. For example, in the case of this hypothetical accident, the health of the population would be affected, and there could be deaths or health disorders, including physiological and psychological disorders. To understand how we move from a financial assessment to a socio-economic one, I would mention that there are estimates, there are valuations of what, for example, a working day is worth when a person is unable to work because of illness. In Lithuania, these estimates are provided and recalculated every year by the Central Project Management Agency. There is also an estimate of a person's life year or lifetime. These are the estimates we use to calculate the value of the project. For example, a human life is now worth about €500,000 according to the table of estimates. There is also an estimate of a day not worked. These estimates allow us to move from financial calculations to socio-economic calculations and to assess costs or benefits. Returning to our practical work, the economic benefit was calculated on a probabilistic basis. Here you can see the different sets of assumptions that were used for this. Each group is further composed of individual elements. Using all these assumptions in the probability calculations, we were able to calculate the outcomes. As you can see, this is related to the probability of the accident itself, what population would be directly affected, what would be the evacuation rates. This is in addition to the estimates of the number of oncological diseases that could be caused by the relevant amounts of radiation. There are also data on the mental disorders of people exposed to such accident, either as a result of direct or indirect exposure. In addition, we have used demographic data for Lithuania. We have also tried to assess qualitative and quantitatively to what extent the investments of this project could be effective in reducing the costs of this theoretical event or accident. This long list of assumptions and variables is used in the calculation algorithm. The results of that calculation algorithm are shown in the table. As you can see, the business as usual scenario number is 89, which means that the assessed cost would be would amount to 89-90 million. A comparison of alternatives 1 and 2 is made then. The indicators in red indicate that alternative 2 is the best of the considered alternatives, while for alternative 1, the value is negative, which means that not a benefit but a cost of 23.5 million. For alternative 2, we have a positive figure, which means a benefit rather than a cost of around 6 million. The graph below illustrates that the benefits consist of, as you can see, there are 5 components. For both alternatives 1 and 2, the benefit of the project would be around 57 million if implemented. And the graph shows how this amount is broken down. If we divide these impacts or benefits into 2 areas, first, radiation effects, and second, mental health problems, this amount of 57 million is roughly divided into 1/3 and 2/3. The specificity of our project is that we are dealing with the low probability and high impact or major nuclear accident. We are dealing with a situation where the probability itself is quite complicated. It is small, but its range is wide. On the right, it is shown the components or elements of the probability. As you can see, these include the accident or meltdown of the reactor core, as well as containment failure, adverse weather conditions, which are also broken down into a number of elements, and the influence of human action or human error. If we can find estimates for the first 3 cases, the 4th case remains unresolved and is the big question mark. If we look at the major nuclear accidents that have occurred, whether at 3 Mile Island in America or at Chernobyl, in both cases there was a huge element of human action and human error. In the case of Fukushima, it is somewhat different. There, the cascading effects were caused by a natural disaster. But in this table, we can see what the probability consists of. This is based more on the safety requirements and analysis of reactors. There are other analyses that look empirically at what historical accidents have actually happened and what their magnitude has been throughout the history of nuclear power plants. That probability is much higher than that calculated on the basis of safety requirements. That probability is 1 incident in 3,025 years. It is significantly different from the probability of safety requirements. We have taken a conservative approach and used the higher probability. A necessary part of all economic calculations is a sensitivity analysis, which assesses the extent to which the variables or assumptions used in the calculation algorithm affect the final outcome. I might say that in support of the plant sector or the cost-benefit analysis of projects that have been carried out, there are usually a few assumptions or variables that show greater sensitivity. Higher sensitivity is found when a change of plus and minus 10% in an assumption changes the outcome by more than 10%. In this case, we have extremely sensitive results, which are quite rare. Interestingly enough, this is true for all major assumptions or parameters. When we change the variable by 10%, we see that the results change by as much as 40, 50, or 60%. This shows that specificity and extreme sensitivity of this project. There are many more assumptions that are sensitive and have a strong impact on the results, but we will look at one, how the probability of an accident affects the results of the calculation. Here you see two graphs. One uses the Ennis coefficient, which show the extent to which the economic benefits are higher or lower than the costs, inputs, or investments of the project on the left, and the graph on the right uses an additional indicator, the net economic value, which is calculated in monetary units. In this case, in thousands of euros. The arrow you see represents the probability that we use in our calculations, which is 1 in 3,625. In the graph on the right, the scale is broken down into very small increments of probability change. One increment equals to 0.005. If we move to the left in two increments, our result could go from an economic benefit of 6 million to 16 million minus. What I mean by this is that the results of the calculation are very sensitive to even the smallest changes in probability, the thousandths of a thousandth. This is shown by the orange line in the graph. In the last slide, all the graphs and data shown so far refer to the probabilistic calculations using low accident probabilities. But in the last slide, we show a so-called deterministic calculation, where we described a theoretical scenario that the event we have defined happens in 2026. And the accident cost is graphically demonstrated. Here, millions have already become billions of euros. The impact on health of the Lithuanian people alone, who would be directly or indirectly affected by the accident, would amount to 7.5 billion euro between 2026 and 2036. Using Fukushima as a case study, we have tried to calculate indicatively how much cost would be caused to agriculture, industry, and tourism, and how long the negative impact would last. In the case of Fukushima, the adverse effects lasted about 10 years. In the case of Lithuania, this could amount to a further 13 billion euros in macroeconomic effects. Lithuania's GDP is projected at 48 billion in 2021. This event puts us in a field of a cost equivalent to the GDP of Lithuania as a whole, or the result of 1 year's work of all Lithuanian people. Although our calculations use a wide range of variables and assumptions, and the results are indeed extremely sensitive, it can be concluded that the investing in preparedness for such an accident makes sense, as the potential negative effects are long-term and enormous. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much to all the presenters for their great efforts to say so much in such a short time. The insiders will probably understand me when I say that let us not do as we used to do in the Soviet school system when we all pretended to understand everything. That last slide is probably still new to many of us. I confess that I'm new to it too. I'm impressed by the way Darius talks about the thousands of thousands. Because of our specialization, we are often only understood by a small circle of people. And the greatest results come when we create shared value together. I suggest we start the debate a little earlier. We have already received questions from at least 2 colleagues. I will present them. I will show them on the screen. The first question was from Ivars, my Latvian colleague. I hope he is listening to the interpreting and will understand in time that we are saying here. His question is quite broad. I will try to summarize first and then ask my colleagues from Jonas's team to answer. The question is basically about critical services, and it is more addressed to the municipal level. What kind of prevention and preparedness measures are foreseen for critical service providers, subjects of entities of civil protection, who organize the activities, including utility services, energy providers, food wholesalers, etc. The general answer is that Lithuania has a 2-level emergency planning and management system. The first, the municipal level, usually summarizes all the issues that the population is directly affected in various situations. Today, I spoke about the national risk analysis. And yesterday, we distributed an updated version of the national risk analysis, which summarizes the projected emergencies at national level. And we are asking all actors in the civil protection system, both municipalities and public authorities, to assess and adjust their plans accordingly. This process takes place on 2 levels. The first is the municipal level, and the second, higher level, is the level of the public authorities. They are regulated by various civil protection legislation. Specifically, with regard to nuclear preparedness, we have the functions approved by governmental decree, which I have already mentioned, and which colleagues from Jostra have mentioned as well. They are defined in a separate plan, the so-called kernel plan, and there is a separate government-approved plan for each situation, which sets out specific areas of responsibility. I hope I have answered the first part of your question, and I will try to define the second part. To ensure adequate or planned preparedness in different sectors, medical, civil protection, municipalities, to the potential accident at the Belarus NPP, what approach did you find appropriate for you? Whether to purchase equipment and required material resources and use them as on daily basis, to sign agreements with contractors to ensure the equipment delivery when necessary, or to manage these resources as a national stockpiling, or mix of all mentioned. It is a very interesting question. We all know more or less what the situation is in general with whatever institution. We can take the example of schools. As the number of children increases, the school infrastructure expands. When the number of children in a region decreases and a large school has only a few pupils, it becomes obvious to everyone that there is no longer a need for the large school. Everywhere we go, the planning of the civil protection system follows a more or less natural and similar pattern. I was struck by one frank interview from a colleague in the health sector who said that the health sector is usually 80 to 90% fulfilled, depending on the daily demand. And when there is a high demand, when there is an event or incident that requires more health services, there is a problem in the system to accumulate that demand. The same human and technical resources are intensified, and it is tried to organize everything through the accumulation principle. But in this case, when we see that the need is too big, accumulation at national level alone is no longer sufficient. And then international or private sector help is sought. In our case, we identify the scale of the need through our capacity targets and other joint studies and decide how much we can store. We have a certain structure of state reserve. It consists of 5 different types. One of them is specifically for civil protection measures. We store part of the measures there. However, our capacity is limited, and the concept is that we can only provide for a few days of peak demand. And then we turn to international help. And the EU civil protection mechanism is the main addressee with which we would actually interact. Here are my reflections on Ivar's question. Do you have anything to add? And Ivar, yourself, do you like this answer? Please respond. Ivars maybe will write to chat, or maybe he wants to speak. Ivars, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone. My name is Ivar Snakurt, State Fire and Rescue Service Civil Protection Department in Latvia. Yes, Edgar has well noted and understand your reply. So this is why I ask this question, because we also look on this issues not even for the radiation safety or such issues, but also from different field of let's say emergencies. And that's a little bit tricky point. We learn also from the COVID story, daily story now, but still there is a little bit messy situation that we can't actually plan enough resources for, let's say, to store in a national stockpile. Even we know that, so there is a typical different problems. Even the storage facilities problem, sometimes there is an old-fashioned, sometimes it's not perfect conditions to store these materials or reserves. Otherwise, when other institutions are involved, so they don't have a knowledge or the, let's say, experience how to store the national stockpiling. And of course, we are a little bit worried about when the crisis comes. So the situation, then we are very dependent on the different role players. That means when one of the chain supply are so weak, that means your potential resources could not be delivered. So now we are looking for the different options that maybe, and what is a little bit tricky for us. That's why I mentioned that if you can share some kind of gap analysis methodology. So now we try to understand what kind of resources should be stored on a daily basis, and how to qualify that such resources should be stored in national stockpiling or should be reserved as, let's say, through the commercial market. So that's a tricky point that could be shared, I think, through the different countries and to pick up some good ideas. So I appreciate that I was taken today on this conference, and well, a lot of things have been done by your side, and I appreciate for that. Over to you.
I hope that my colleagues have chosen the interpreting option and understood Ivars. Thank you, Ivars. It is very nice that we are communicating and that the communication will allow us to cooperate better. That is the point, as Jonas have said, of the insurance policy. The cost of the insurance policy goes down if we share the burden together. There are all sorts of ways to prepare more effectively. And efficiency is understood as achieving more with less. And today is also an attempt to look at how we understand the needs that will arise in a very rare but real situation. I would agree with Ivars that the only better real exercise is COVID, because it is very close to the situation. On the other hand, we see what is happening in Gran Canaria. I have been there, I have been to some beautiful places there, and I have even climbed near that volcano. And now it is devastating the whole of that beautiful island. It is very similar. And when I hear what various people are saying in the media, how they are testifying about their experiences, I get the impression that they knew about the volcano and how its eruption might affect them. But they hoped it would not happen. This is one of the key illusions. I have already talked about this in the seminar. If we agree that it is not going to happen, then we also need to say to everyone that we believe that the situation is not going to happen, and there is no point in blaming each other or explaining why we are unprepared. What we are trying to agree on this particular case is that we have acknowledged what the situation is likely to be, and we have agreed on the capacity targets, and we have to provide them in good faith. In terms of equipment efficiency and so on, as I have already said, in very small countries there is little chance of maintaining a large and high-quality capacity. We do not have any Salisbury accident or other incidents on a daily basis that would require a lot of quality capacity. Therefore, there is a discussion within the framework of the civil protection mechanisms on where the capacity could be hosted, either at the rescue level or at the European civil protection level. It would also be logical to have more capacities there that could be deployed locally. Capacity, on the other hand, refers to the overall deployment of technical resources and people with certain skills and their ongoing maintenance. In this situation, which is more or less fixed, it is important to have a complete infrastructure or those key capabilities and resources that can quickly and qualitatively identify what danger is and where the danger is. Ivars, I invite you to look at our exercise material. We have posted it on the Argus platform. In 2019, Those discussions were still very fresh and new, but we have really tried to at least show the worst situation that we see in the 48-hour time frame. I could go on and on, but I really encourage a conversation, especially at the international level, to see how we understand the situation. The civil safety community does not need to be told whether they believe or not, for the most part. The question is what the public understands and knows, and what politicians have written into their programs. I agree with all my colleagues, Povilas, Jonas, Darius, and others, that too much and too little are the same in the extreme. If we invest too much, we go beyond what is reasonable. If we invest too little, we are not prepared because we think that the event will not happen, because the reactors are getting safer, and so on. But 25 years have passed since Chernobyl, and Fukushima has happened. I'm speaking in simple human terms, so that 3,625 years calculating the probability of an accident in terms of the hours of operation of the reactors seems like a mathematical formula for me. However, we feel that its situations are occurring. The other obvious thing is national security. For example, the armed forces receive at least 2% of GDP every year. And if they were completely meaningless, those funds would not be allocated and no exercises would be organized. Therefore, I think that our preparation, our preparedness, and its development for a major event in society is understandable. I apologize for this long speech. Let's move on to the next question. I would like to say something from the project's point of view, how we have dealt with the issue of the resources. First of all, we have tried to answer what the municipalities need to have, what they need to have for daily basis, and there is indeed something to improve. Then we looked at what needs to be in place at national level, and some of the things that were concentrated in the municipalities, such as the fixed sanitation stations, they were moved to another level. In terms of emergency costs, food, drinking water, hygiene products, it is very important that the municipalities have agreements with the supermarkets chains to ensure that there is a rapid supply in case of need. And alternatives are important for such important measures. On some issues, it is worth going international, with several countries involved. And another aspect that is mentioned in our project is cross-sectoral measures. For example, there can be joint investments with the border guard, which are ready, and in the event of an emergency, those resources can be used. I think that this is a very important issue, to divide the resources clearly between the institutions and to prepare operational plans after the disaster has already occurred. This is something that we have certainly had a lot of discussion and consideration in the drafting process. Thank you, Jonas. I see Mikhaila's hand. If I may, we would like to start by responding to a question from Žydrūnas Jakštonis, to which Jonas could respond. Has a damage assessment been carried out to estimate the cost of health damage caused by radiation to the population as a result of the accident? Is there at least an understanding that the main focus of the fight should be on protecting the population from radiation? Maybe Darius can answer, because this is a key aspect of socio-economic benefits. Can I show a presentation again? In a moment. The information on this slide answers your question. As you can see, if nothing is done, which is a completely unrealistic theoretical scenario, the probability that costs would be 89 million. However, if this project goes ahead, this cost would be reduced to 31 million. In other words, the impact of the project's investment is about 57 million. As regards the proportions of that cost, as regards the radiation mentioned in your question, it is shown here that 65% of the potential cost from this accident is attributable to the radiation exposure of people who would be present in both areas. The remaining 35 is more related to psychological and mental health. The answer is therefore that about 65% would be due to radiation health effects. This amounts to about 37 million euro. In this case, that is the answer. Thank you, Darius. Mikhail, it will be probably easier for you to talk. If you allow me, Edgaras. Good afternoon. As I did not see my question on the list of questions, I do not know where it went during the editing process, so maybe I will not repeat that question and we will deal with it in the order of business, I hope. But I want to thank all the experts for this project, for their participation, for all the presentations. Of course, this is not the beginning of the debate. We were already talking about this before this project, both with the department and with other institutions. It is probably not the end of the discussion, because it never ends and we will always need to think and proceed with the work. Here is the second event now. We have already attended the seminar and we have received the project. We have made comments, and it is a pity that we cannot yet see the table with the answers. It would be very good to see it as soon as possible, with a response to our comments, and to finally agree on everything. And the question was that at the beginning of the presentation, I had the impression that maybe the presenters had not seen all our comments. Later on, as the presentations were going on, I realized that maybe they had seen them, but they had not taken them into account to the fullest. I would therefore ask that we continue with this work, and once we have seen the responses, we can agree on the text definitely. But of course, life does not end with the project and draft. We will continue to work and discuss all together. Do not forget us. Thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. Exclusively, I will not exaggerate by telling that your contribution to this project is the greatest. Thank you for appointing a representative to the Service Acceptance Committee. Emilis Bashkis is working together in this committee. I think that we will certainly look at all of your comments, and I think that you were referring to the thoughts and presentation by Povilas on deeper analysis. We will be able to discuss this in the acceptance committee. I think we all understand, colleagues, that the service provider is entitled to their opinion. They have some expertise and knowledge and know-how. Unless their proposals or recommendations are contrary to the legislation, we can discuss those issues. And we will do that. But I think that differences of opinions are usually the basis for progress. And the ability to listen and to understand different views and to live together by respecting different views is very important. We are all sailing in the same boat and we have to agree on the direction of travel. Sometimes there are discussions before the journey. Someone wants to sail to the right or to the left, but we are community and we have to come together and to be on the same page. Thank you, Mikhailas. A short comment, Edgaras. Some very smart optimizers are already sitting without petrol. Thank you. I see Mr. Haroldas, and I also see Miss Miriam O'Connor. I will give the floor to Haroldas, and I will ask Miriam to speak. Some interruptions. I have helped my colleague with the sound. Haroldas, the floor is yours. And then I would encourage DG ECHO representative Miriam to say some words. Hello. I want to thank the experts at Yostra for their great work. A 5-year plan of measures to prepare for a possible nuclear accident at the Belarusian NPP has now been submitted to the government for consideration. I would like to ask if the Yostra experts can carefully review that plan and, according to the alternative they propose, tell us which measures they suggest to keep, to maintain, and which to drop off, so that the use of the results of your project is clear. Would it be possible to ask for such help? Thank you. Let me be brief. Of course, we can look at those measures and give our opinion. On the other hand, our investment project and its annexes are very clear on the measures that we are proposing. And any specialist, any expert can take our result and compare it with the measures in any other document. I think that both we can do that, and also people from outside can also see what we are proposing and compare it with other documents or solutions. Thank you. We'll know we can contact you. Can I say a few words? Yes, Rimas, a few words, please. I have also read it, and I have to say that I was very impressed by this project. I have been working in the system for 37 years. I think it is historic that this issue is being taken very seriously. It is probably a great credit to the department, because there is no one else to initiate these things anymore. I know what the problems are in the district right now, and in this project I have found the issues that should be addressed, which is warning the population, sanitation, hosting of the population, preparing of the structures. It would be very good to get this project moving. And if the funds are made available to set priorities and move forward. I'm very happy about this matter, and I'm glad that there are people in Lithuania that have moved this forward. I really wish the promoters great success. A lot of material has been gathered and a lot of analysis has been done in such a short time. Well done, Jostra team. They have earned their rewards. Thank you, Rimas, for the positive emotion. I like that you said little by little, consistently, we will achieve everything. Moving away from nuclear preparedness a little bit, I listened for an interview with an expert in training champion athletes in Norway. He's an American living in Norway. It seems that athletes are familiar with the yellow, green and red zones, which depend on parameters such as heart rate or blood oxygen levels and so on. And it turns out that athletes with the highest performance tend to train in the green zone. 85% of their training is done at a very consistent but specific pace, knowing what they are doing and what they want to achieve. That's why we don't need to plan too many and too big jumps. What is important is consistent work with everyone knowing their specific responsibilities and roles in the process. We need to agree at the beginning so that we are each aware of our responsibilities and our contribution. And then we can move forwards and towards the goals. So many beautiful words to say. We're slowly coming to the end of the event. We still have a question from Ivars, who asks, what after the project? What are the next steps? The steps are as follows. This investment project as a service is coming to an end. The documentation prepared by Jostra is impressive. It will be translated into English as well. I will share it publicly as far as possible in all possible formats. We are launching even more actions. Just as Harold has also mentioned, the Ministry of the Interior is already beginning to step up coordination between authorities and municipalities in preparation for a possible accident. I hope that the results of this project will contribute to a better functioning civil protection system. What more could the European Commission do? Maybe Miriam could tell us. She has not responded yet, but this is a future discussion. We will want to ask some questions to the Civil Protection Committee about what role and responsibility the European Commission could see in this place. I don't have any more specific ideas. I do not see any questions. Colleagues, thank you for your time. Let us work together. Miriam was ready to speak, I see.
Miriam, do you hear me? Miriam, kažkas ten gal su
Does
techniniais
not
dalykais.
seem to happen.
Now you hear me. Can you
Yes,
speak?
I just was able to unmute now,
Okay.
sorry. So I would just like to say thank you very much for the invitation to the conference. It has been very interesting to listen to all the different speakers, and it has been very interesting to follow this project from an administrative point of view, also see all the hard work that has been done over the past year and a half or so, if I remember correctly. And I wish you all the best for the future, and with all the plans. I hope that everything will go as you expect for the end of the project. I see also my colleague who has just joined, DG Echo, to replace our technical desk officer, Evie, is also present. So I don't know if he would like to say anything, but that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eva. Miriam. Evie, do you have something to share?
Sorry, I was talking about Philip, our new colleague.
Philip.
I don't know if he was in the meeting with us last week. So.
Okay, Philip, do you hear us somewhere?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us at the European Commission to the meeting, to the conference. It's appreciated. I have recently taken over Evie's job, well, not Evie's, part of Evie's job, but also the job as desk officer for Lithuania, and I will be following this and other projects very closely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Na tai kolegos.
Well, colleagues, thank you. Thank you once more for your time. We are finishing as planned until 1 p.m. We had the possibility to talk. And as already said by Mikhail, the discussions are not ending with this project. They will be even more intense. Thank you for your thoughts, for your participation. We will work together on this issue. Have a nice day and stay safe. Thank you. We will continue with the work together.
Ačiū
viso gero.
Ačiū viso gero.
Ačiū viso gero.
Ačiū viso gero.
Thank you very much for everything. Thanks again.
Ačiū viso gero.
Geriausio.
Nu, bet pasišypsodama.